Hey everyone, I want to do some work with you today on answering questions for 1984 because some of the questions can be tricky and I thought it would be useful for us to just troubleshoot some of them. So let's firstly have a look at this question here. So we've got, to what extent has the composer of your prescribed text raised questions into the human experience? So when you're looking at your questions, you always want to look from the composer's purpose and then, of course, how your analysis that you've prepared, your points, your quotes, and so forth, fits into that question. So in your first paragraph of 1984, you should probably be talking about the way that totalitarian governments, the government there has established its power through oppression. It creates this image of stability and wanting to take care of the people and safety and so forth. But then what's actually happening is very oppressive. So we've got Big Brother, you've got that family figure head sort of position there, but then there's very ominous images and so forth. Anyway, I'm not going to go into an analysis here. But linking that back to Orwell's purpose, Orwell is trying to warn his readers about the dangers of totalitarian governments and the oppression that can result from a government that has got so much power that the individual has, got no ability to rebel or be individual or have any sort of freedom. So then when we look here at this particular question, obviously to what extent, you always need to make sure you say to what extent. So to a small extent, to a large extent, to some extent. And that will really be based on what you're actually going to argue. So let's go to the next key word, which I would say is raised questions. So when, again, go to Orwell, what is he raising questions about, or challenging is probably the best way to kind of rephrase that. And that's a good thing to always do as well. Like, think of a synonym. So if you're looking at questions, you would like look at, thinks about, like assesses, maybe critiques. But then think too about the fact that something like raises questions is just kind of quite an open-ended thing to do. Like, you just raise questions. You're like, oh, well, what do you think about this? Very different, though, from being quite assertive, which I'll go on to argue that Orwell is quite assertive in the way that he presents his ideas into the human experience, which is the last part. So when we're looking at human experience, you're going to be looking at power, oppression, rebellion, suppression of the identity, those sorts of things. So going back again to looking at how to answer this question overall, if we're looking at what questions Orwell raises, I would argue that to some extent he does raise questions, but actually what he does even more so is he is like challenging the representation of those totalitarian powers very strongly. He's not just like, oh, what do you think? He's like, if you let these totalitarian governments and these people in power have this much authority over you for the sake of preserving safety and so forth, these are the consequences. You are not going to have any freedom. You are not going to have any identity. You will not be able to, act in your own free will and so forth, which is obviously a human experience that we very much value. So think always about how you can maybe go further with the question than what initially appears to be the case. Most students, and when I say most, I mean like 9.5 out of 10, will just agree with the question and then, just kind of use it throughout as best as they can. But where you'll get a much higher mark is when you show what teachers call higher order thinking, where you've actually assessed something about the question and gone beyond. So what that looks like here is, rather than just saying that Orwell raises questions, you're saying that he not only raises questions, but actively or strongly challenges these particular issues in society, these powers and so forth. So what you can see there is I've somewhat disagreed, actually, or I've taken something from the question and extended it further. And that is something that if you can do that, and of course it depends on the question, there may not be any room for that, but if there is, don't miss that opportunity, because that is going to be really valuable in terms of you being able to have a really good answer to the question, and one that's really thoughtful, because if you just go off what the question says, it doesn't really show that you've thought about it further than just its face value. Great, let's have a look at the next one. So then we've got significant experiences trigger strong emotions, but the most worthwhile experiences help us make sense of the unpredictability of life. Oh my gosh, this is a huge question. So we've got significant experiences that we need to break down. What are those? And then what are the strong emotions that are triggered? You would definitely want to be talking about fear in this particular one, because that's a strong emotion that people experience that have given them, that have allowed them to give up their power to those totalitarian regimes that Orwell is warning us about. There's the elimination of emotions like, I don't know if freedom is really an emotion, but maybe happiness, and those sorts of things that obviously Winston feels when he's with Julia, but isn't really something fostered in a normal environment. And then, you've got the worthwhile experiences. So what experience are worthwhile? Maybe that's when you're looking at freedom, autonomy. Those are the worthwhile ones. Help us make sense of the unpredictability of life. And this is a really tricky part, because a lot of people, again, they'll just go with what the question says and they'll be like, oh, yep, okay, the power is unpredictable, or Winston's unpredictable, or they'll think about how, like, what parts of the novel that maybe they haven't really got great analysis on, or haven't prepared, because again, you've only got 40 minutes for this, so you can't now look at this question and then go and find the best bits of the book that really relate. You just don't have time for that. You've got the analysis you've learned, you've got the quotes you've got. How are you going to make it work with this question? So once again, what you want to go for is having a look into the question from Orwell's purpose. Why is it that this particular society was created, this totalitarian society, where you've got the ones in power, and then you've got all the people who are the collective and the individual who are just completely oppressed? And the reason for that is that they're trying to eliminate something like unpredictability. So unpredictability causes fear, it causes instability. And that's something that Winston starts doing when he's questioning everything. And they don't like that. That doesn't work for them to continue being in power. So once again, with this question, there is some space here for you to not disagree, but don't just say, oh, there's the power is unpredictable, or the, Winston's journey is unpredictable, or the ending is unpredictable. Like, that could be the case in a way, because, we kind of think Winston's going to get away with it and he thinks that he's, getting his freedom, but then that turns out completely not to be the case. And so you could say that there is some unpredictability there in the ending. But how you'll be able to use that concept throughout your essay is to start off with the fact that Orwell's warning against the fear and unpredictability in society or within the individual that has them give up their free will, or has them relinquish their freedom and their autonomy in order to have the state protect them. And it's in that that's what he's warning us against. He's saying, don't be so afraid of instability and unpredictability that you then go off and give away all of your civil liberties to government that then can completely oppress you, and then you'll have no chance to even rebel. Because obviously Winston tries to do that, but there's no room for that. There's no possibility for that. And that's how Orwell structured it. It's a dystopian text. So he's saying you can't do anything now. This has gone on too far. So the idea is that it shocks you in the present, where we don't have that situation to that degree, and make sure that you are not getting into that situation, right? So it's supposed to be shocking. It's supposed to tell you that the amazing because there's great stuff in unpredictability of life. There's discovering things. There's there's love. There's all the things that Winston's trying to get, freedom and identity and personal development. All of that is just what is suppressed. Knowledge, discovery, whatever. All of that is oppressed by the state. So again, this is a really big question. So that's why I'm saying, have a think about it from the top down, going always firstly from Orwell's purpose, and then it will link really well to what your argument is, okay? As long as you've sort of structured it from the way of being like, look at this oppression of the state, this is how they do it, this is the individual who wants to rebel against that and attain that human experience of freedom and so forth, and then there's no ability to do that. He's just crushed completely. So when you just look at it chronologically, there's nothing, super complicated about that. And then looking at it from Orwell's purpose you'll get a really good answer to the question, and your essay will follow suit. So last question I thought we'd look at is the 2019 HSC question, which is, to what extent does the exploration of human experience in 1984 invite you to reconsider your understanding of loneliness? And I really like this question because it initially seems like it doesn't really relate to the text. Like, oh, what's this text got to do with loneliness? I don't really know. And so once again, breaking it down from the top, from Orwell's perspective, and then seeing how you can sort of think about it from that way, rather than going, oh, okay, let me think of like little bits and pieces in the text where loneliness is experienced. I mean, you just don't have the text in front of you. That's the reality. As much as I'd love that to be the case, and that should be the way English is done in some ways, that's not how they can test it at this point anyway. So you have to just go with the time and the limitations that you have to work with. Okay, so when we're looking at loneliness, it's looking at, I think, probably the individual experience more than, I suppose, the collective. Right. And because the individual is oppressed, there's this idea that, the oppression of the state causes that alienation and loneliness to be experienced by the individual, who has no room to express themselves or, form or do anything outside of what is allowed for by the state. And so if you work with the idea of loneliness in relation to things like alienation and also identity, all of these things connect together to show you what is being lost. And I suppose like that lack of freedom to be self-expressed and to have differences, that leads to a sense of loneliness as well, because again, the state is oppressing the individual to such a degree that they are no longer free to be themselves or to express or do anything outside of what the state says, nor can they express that to anyone because they're going to get dobbed in and there's going to be consequences. So then they experience that profound level of loneliness. So again, going from that structure we talked about, like starting off by looking at the oppression of the state on the individual, Winston as that lonely, alienated figure. Then he goes into the state of rebellion, where he tries to remedy his loneliness and his alienation by developing this relationship with Julia. I always think discussing that relationship is going to be really key, because that's the real central location of his rebellion. He obviously does a number of other things, but that's a really big one. Also because right at the end, when he is completely broken down, he just gives Julia up. He's like, take her, rip her face, whatever the quote is, at the end, which shows that he's just been completely oppressed by the state. And that is the full-blown realization of him being in a completely isolated, lonely state, where he can no longer, he can't be an individual, and he has no sense of freedom. So, again, like if you look at that on first glance, it looks obscure. Like, I don't know what to write about in relation to the text, but the text is about whatever the text is about. Like, that doesn't change. So therefore your main points and your analysis shouldn't really change, because they're the best ones. Hopefully you pick those. But, they're the ones that work and explain the text and Orwell's purpose in the best way. So by exploring this profound experience of loneliness and alienation of the individual in this oppressive state, Orwell is warning or cautioning his audience about, the dangers, yet again, of, giving up power for, or the individual's power for the protection of the state, which in this case has become absolute, and therefore warning us not to go down that path.